All right, closing out this section on psychological disorders, I'm now going to focus on dissociative disorders, personality disorders, and eating disorders. So, a dissociative disorder is going to involve experiences of what we term dissociation. So, this is going to be basically some sort of an out of body experience, so a separation of conscious awareness from thoughts, memory, bodily sensations, feelings, or even from identity. So, you basically disassociate from yourself. You feel sort of detached from your physical body. You sort of have a disembodied sense of who you are. Now, we all have this experience every once in a while of sort of out of body experiences, sort of feeling confused about who we are. Again, the idea is that a dissociative disorder needs to rise to the level of causing significant dysfunction and distress. So, something that causes someone harm or impairs them socially. Some classic ways that dissociative disorders can manifest, one is going to be dissociative amnesia. So, this is going to be when you basically have a blackout, but not because of drinking. So, loss of memory with no known physical cause and an inability to recall selected memories or any memories. So, this is obviously going to be pretty scary. People can do things and have no memory of having done that. They could drive a car, they could leave the oven on, they could do something really dangerous and have no idea. They completely don't remember. They basically have a severe blackout and they have a extreme loss of memory. A dissociative fugue, if you remember season 1 of Breaking Bad, when Walt sort of ran off to cook meth in the desert and he came back and he said he had no idea where he'd been. This would actually technically be what we call a dissociative fugue. So, fugue is a really fun word. It basically means like a running away kind of a spree. So, a dissociative fugue is going to be when someone runs away. They basically just wander off and do a whole bunch of things that they will have no memory of before. They might start a new identity, they might start a new life, and they basically have no idea what they've been doing. They sort of run away for maybe weeks, and then they just wander back and they have no idea what they did. The dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personalities, is also a class of dissociative disorders. But I'm going to focus more on DID because it's a very interesting and somewhat controversial psychological disorder. So, dissociative identity disorder, it's been the object of some cultural interest. There's lots of movies and medias that depict a multiple personalities. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the sort of classic example, but Me, Myself, and Irene, Fight Club, a recent movie, I think it was called Split. Basically, there's this cultural idea of this multiple personalities disorder, but the controversy with the disorder is basically whether or not we can actually trust that it exists. So, if you've heard of multiple personality disorder, this is now referred to as dissociative identity disorder because it doesn't always manifest with a multitude of distinct identities. Now, DID is going to be when an individual sort of has distinct personalities that might manifest at different points in time. An individual may or may not be aware that there are these multiple sides to their personality duking it out. They may or may not be aware that there are these various personalities kicking around in their head. So it's quite rare, and like I said, it's somewhat controversial. The idea is that how can we really know that an individual is truly experiencing all of these identities at different points in time? You basically can't ever know for sure if this is a real disorder or if it's, basically made up because it could be that it's just someone with a really active imagination coming up with these different sides of their identity. Additionally, it's been used as a criminal defense. The Hillside Strangler, for example, tried to defend himself in court for the various murders he committed by saying that he had multiple identities and it was a different identity that had done it. Um, Basically, his defense was debunked and it didn't fly in court, and it really never has. But again, this is why it's maybe somewhat controversial. The idea is if somebody wanted to get out of responsibility for something, they could just invent a different identity and blame them for it. So, more so than any other disorder, there's controversy around whether or not this is in fact even a real thing that people experience or if it's just completely made up. And in fact, the numbers indicate that fewer than a quarter of psychiatrists actually believe that it's a valid disorder. Most psychiatrists think that, again, it's basically a put on. Individuals who ostensibly are suffering from DID are basically just making it up. And there's reason to support that point of view. There's other compelling explanations for what might cause someone to manifest these distinct personalities. One is that it might just be someone, again, with a runaway imagination that's having fun basically creating these different characters. Additionally, some doctors believe that the development and manifestation of different personalities is just a suggestion by the therapist and that the patient sort of complies and acts that out. So there are some reasons to think that DID is not a legitimate illness. More so than any other disorder, there's controversy around whether or not it's even a real thing. There is, though, some support for DID being a legitimate diagnosis. You do see different brain signatures. Again, there appears to be something of a biological root of experiencing DID. Now, again, it's important to keep in mind that despite the fact that there are these different brain signatures associated with individuals who appear to be suffering from DID, again, more so than any other disorder, it's a little bit hard for us to know if the actual disorder is more so a disorder of making things up and exaggerating, or if it's truly this genuine experience of having these different personalities. And you see some other kind of interesting physical differences in terms of individuals who uh, manifest DID. So basically, this is a really interesting disorder because it is controversial and we don't really have an answer. I guess my take on it is that if someone appears to be suffering, they should get help. They should have a treatment plan that helps them manage their life. More so than any other disorder, though, it does appear to be a little bit controversial, and the research is not so conclusive that what people are experiencing or exhibiting as DID is, in fact, what we conceptualize it to be. So, whether or not it is this pattern of exaggerating and having different sides of your personality that you sort of intentionally switch in and out, or if it's something that an individual has no control over. Again, these are all things we don't actually quite know. So, now moving on to personality disorders, I'm going to focus more on antisocial personality disorders. There's a ton of personality disorders listed in the DSM that are all slightly different, and so I wouldn't have time to cover all of them. So, I'm going to broadly introduce the idea of a personality disorder and then just focus on one that's kind of interesting. So, personality disorder, if you recall when we learned about personality, personality is basically the semi stable traits or characteristics that an individual has that makes them who they are. So, personality disorder is going to be when your personality characteristics are inflexible and enduring behavior patterns that cause social difficulty and impairment. Now, personality disorders, they're very tough to treat because, as I said, they have to do with who you are as a person. It has to do with your individuality. A fair amount of individuals who likely could be classified as having a personality disorder don't actually end up seeking help because they might not actually think that there's anything wrong. They just think that that's who they are. So I know I mentioned in an earlier video that being an asshole isn't necessarily a psychological illness. It might be the case that some people behave like assholes and it's a personality disorder, but that doesn't stop it from genuinely being who they are, if you know what I mean. In terms of ways that we understand the different kinds of personality disorders, we tend to put them into three clusters. We've got our eccentric odd cluster that includes schizoid personality. This is going to share some features of schizophrenia, but not necessarily all the severe delusions and hallucinations, but you do see social impairment and that flattened affect. So there are some similarities with schizophrenia, but a schizoid personality disorder is quite different. You see some anxiety based personality disorders. So, for example, an avoidant personality disorder, where an individual is so afraid of social rejection that they completely withdraw and they avoid people entirely. And the most interesting cluster, your dramatic personality disorder. So, if you ever heard of histrionic personality disorder, that's more dramatic. So, somebody who's massively attention seeking and dramatic and self centered, that might be someone with a histrionic personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder is going to live in this cluster, and your borderline personality disorder is going to live in this cluster. If you ever watched the movie Girl Interrupted, the protagonist of that movie had a borderline personality disorder diagnosis. Again, if you've ever known anyone in your life that was a massive drama queen, histrionic, attention seeking, and narcissistic, you might think to yourself, Did that person have a personality disorder, or were they just an asshole? Completely possible that they were both. Again, personality disorders are tough to treat because it's tough for people to see their individual characteristics and who they are as inherently wrong. Again, the idea of what would classify someone as having a personality disorder is the impairment that it causes. So if somebody is experiencing these symptoms, but they're not experiencing impairment that drives them to get treatment, it's just going to make it really hard for anyone suffering these disorders to improve. Okay, so again, these are the three clusters with the disorders contained within the various clusters. Again, there's a lot, so I'm not going to be able to go through all of them. So I'm just going to focus on one from my favorite cluster, the dramatic cluster, and I'm going to talk more about the antisocial personality disorder. Again, here's another great example of a term that is colloquially quite misunderstood. A lot of people use the term antisocial to mean that they don't like engaging socially, that they're more introverted. That is not what antisocial means in terms of psychiatry and psychological illness. It's quite distinct, actually. Antisocial personality disorder is actually a lack of conscience for wrongdoing. So basically, an antisocial person is only looking out for themselves and they don't really feel any regret or remorse for the ways that they hurt other people. So this is going to be someone who's maybe quite cold and doesn't care about the ways that they might be hurting other people. So this might be associated with violence or aggressiveness, impulsiveness, and basically a lack of regard for other people. You see the ways that antisocial is diagnosed looking slightly different in older individuals than younger individuals, basically because you sort of see an escalation of what people are able to get away with as they get older. So if an individual is engaging in certain conduct before the age of 15, so truancy, skipping school, running away, destroying property, harming pets, setting fires, lying, these are all the sorts of things that if someone is exhibiting those particular behaviors before the age of 15, you might have someone who will develop an antisocial personality disorder. These are sort of indications of worse behaviors to come. Now, one thing that's important to note is that any one of these behaviors on the right by themselves does not necessarily mean that someone is antisocial or has a personality disorder, right? Skipping school or destroying something when you're a kid, any of those behaviors in isolation is likely not going to rise to the level of being antisocial. It's consistently engaging in these sort of more and more dangerous behaviors. And again, the list on the left shows you that this personality disorder tends to manifest in some pretty severe ways that these people would be mistreating others. Risk factors for the development of an antisocial personality disorder. You see individuals who are more impulsive or inhibited at more of a risk. People who are unconcerned with social affiliation and rewards. Again, this disorder is characterized by a lack of a regard for other people. So you basically don't have those same maybe guilt mechanisms that would keep you from engaging in dangerous or reckless behavior because you just sort of don't care. Diminished anxiety, so actually being kind of fearless, which you might think of as a good thing, this might be a risk factor for the development of antisocial. And just basically not having a strong ability to develop fears. Again, being fearless by itself might be considered a good thing, but all of these are psychological risk factors for the development of antisocial. Additionally, you do see an environmental or situational component whereby children who are in abusive environments, who have maybe inconsistent or unnurturing caretakers when they're a child, again, this might lead to a heightened risk for antisocial. You do see a lot of biological differences in individuals who would be diagnosed with antisocial personality. You see lower levels of stress hormones, which might be associated with those diminished fear and anxiety responses. And you see overall less physiological arousal. So, in situations that most people would find prompts a lot of stress and would prompt the physiological markers of stress, racing heart, sweaty palms, individuals with antisocial will likely not exhibit those responses. On a structural level, you see a smaller amygdala, which likely leads to, again, the differences in the experience of fear. Reduction in the prefrontal cortex tissue. Again, the prefrontal lobes are largely thought to be important for self-control and long-term planning. So this structural difference in the prefrontal cortex might have something to do with the impulsivity and recklessness of antisocial. And overall reduction in brain activity in the limbic system, which, if you recall, is thought to be the emotional part of the brain. So maybe the diminished capacity to feel things for other people's and to experience empathy. Possibly this has its roots in reduced activity in the limbic system. In terms of applying the biopsychosocial approach to our understanding of antisocial, you do see that various environmental, biological, and psychological factors lend themselves to the likelihood or vulnerability towards antisocial personality. So, for example, birth complications and poverty are associated with increased risk of committing antisocial type crimes, so violent crimes that hurt other people. It's important to note, though, that merely to engage in violent crime is not the same thing as being an antisocial person. So, although the fact that the Venn diagram does have some overlap where many criminals might be thought to rise to the diagnostic level for antisocial, there are many individuals who have antisocial personality who do not commit violent crimes. You see their disorder manifest in other ways. And additionally, there's many criminals who are not antisocial that do have empathy and they do love certain people in their life. So it's important to understand the way that the environment and psychological and biological factors interplay to impact whether someone will be antisocial and how that antisocial behavior develops, and also the sorts of behaviors associated with antisocial that do not necessarily mean that someone actually has the disorder. So, then lastly, I'm going to touch on eating disorders. So, an eating disorder is going to be any psychological disorder that impacts someone's eating behaviors or somebody's perception of their own body that causes, again, changes to healthy eating patterns. Individuals with eating disorders often have extreme and unrealistic ideas about what their body should look like and what they look like. So, an individual, like, for example, the classic case of Karen Carpenter, one of the first celebrities to publicly lose her life to anorexia nervosa, you might think to yourself that the person depicted on the left, Karen Carpenter when she was healthy, looks great, looks perfectly normal. She's thin, she's beautiful. She suffered from anorexia because she had this excessive desire for extreme thinness to the point where she did end up losing her life. Someone with an eating disorder has a desire to control their food consumption, to control feelings of hunger, to not eat when they're hungry as a way to try and change their body. Eating disorders are highly comorbid with depression and anxiety, and sometimes substance abuse to a certain extent, not always, but you definitely do see a fair amount of comorbidity with eating disorders. Additionally, the hallmark of eating disorders is going to be all the health problems that go hand in hand with these maladaptive and unhealthy eating behaviors. So, for example, individuals with anorexia or bulimia are highly likely to actually succumb to, for example, heart failure. So, since someone is engaging in unhealthy eating behaviors, you do see health problems manifest as a result. Another example of health problems that might arise, for example, if you're talking bulimia, where an individual is inducing themselves to vomit, you see the chronic vomiting lead to tooth decay and issues with the esophagus. Esophagus? Esophagus? Esophagus. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So you do see a lot of health problems associated with individuals who have eating disorders. And actually, anorexia is the most lethal psychological illness. It is the psychological disorder that causes the most death because of the experience of that illness. Okay, so I've mentioned some of the kinds of eating disorders just a second ago, but these are the basic distinctions of your classic eating disorders. So again, anorexia nervosa is going to be the compulsion to lose weight, desire for extreme thinness. Additionally, the criteria for anorexia involves some physical symptoms. So, for example, amenorrhea or no longer experiencing your period. This is often going to be a diagnostic criteria for anorexia. Fun fact about developments for the DSM. Amenorrhea actually used to be a necessary symptom to receive the diagnosis of anorexia. There definitely are higher rates of anorexia in women, but we likely are undercounting the amount of men who actually have anorexia because, again, the symptoms are largely targeted towards women. It's that sort of rare medical illness that we have a much better understanding of how it plays out in women. But all of that is to say that there are various physical criteria as well as psychological criteria that go into the experience or the diagnosis of anorexia nervosa. So, anorexia is going to be, again, someone who is desirous of extreme thinness, desire to lose weight, and an extreme rigid control over their food intake. Bulimia nervosa, on the other hand, is going to be a cycle of binging and purging. So, an individual with bulimia has this extreme, uncontrollable compulsion to binge eat, sometimes eating gigantic amounts of food that would not be normal in any single sitting, followed by a compulsion to purge the food through some way. So, this can be vomiting. People often think of vomiting after eating, the classic way that bulimia manifests. You could qualify for a diagnosis of bulimia if you abuse laxatives or exercise compulsively after eating in a way to work off all of those calories in a way that's unmanageable and unhealthy. One thing that I'll note here is that, again, a understanding of bulimia needs to take into account that this needs to be a behavior that causes distress, feels uncontrollable, and is socially inappropriate. What I mean by that is we all binge eat sometimes, you know? We've all sat down to maybe a Thanksgiving dinner and ate until we were stuffed, until we were uncomfortable. Again, that's normal. Doing this in isolation in certain social contexts and cultural contexts is normal. The idea of experiencing bulimia is that you are binging constantly in a way that is causing you significant distress and impairment, and additionally, this purging after the fact. Then you also have your classification for binge eating. So this is going to be the same binging cycle as bulimia, but instead of being followed by a attempt to purge, it's followed by extremely negative psychological and emotional experiences. So you feel awful about yourself, you feel depressed, you feel guilty, you feel like a bad person. Again, binge eating disorder is not necessarily eating too much here or there. This is a specific disorder whereby the person feels like they cannot control their eating and the psychological experience that follows it. In terms of risk factors for the development of an eating disorder, there's lots of social and cultural factors. For example, a lot about the family environment growing up can be a risk factor for the development of an eating disorder. So, for example, the mother as a caretaker has a large influence on the way children's evaluations of weight and appearance and eating develop. So, if the mother in a family is overly preoccupied with weight, that ups a child's risk factor of developing an eating disorder. Negative evaluations in the family, being looked down upon in the context of the family. Additionally, you see certain family group dynamics that differentially will lead to risk for bulimia or anorexia. So, for example, individuals who are in families in which there's a large tendency towards obesity are actually more likely to develop bulimia. The family dynamic that more so is a risk factor for anorexia, though, is going to be that type A sort of environment, highly competitive, high achieving. So you definitely see a lot of family factors weigh in terms of the likelihood of developing an eating disorder. And it makes sense if you think about it, right? Growing up in your family house, that is when you sort of got your model for eating and body image. And so family factors, particularly in eating disorders, are heavily impactful. Additionally, there's cultural factors. Certain cultures do not actually have instances of eating disorders. You certainly see higher amounts of eating disorders, for example, in Western culture, in which there's maybe a very unrealistic ideal for body appearance, a preoccupation with thinness, and with a quote unquote perfect body that, by the way, doesn't exist, but this sort of idealization of physical perception, physical perfection. Additionally, the presence of gender stereotypes. You certainly see gender differences in terms of likelihood of developing eating disorders. Likely, this is partially due to the fact that the expectations for women largely is that they may be objects of beauty. Objectification theory describes the cultural context in which women feel like they are reduced to sexual objects whose only worth and value is in that as a sex object and an object of beauty on which to be looked. These stereotypes do lend themselves to a cultural context in which eating disorders might develop. Now, it's not all cultural context, it's not all seeing beautiful models in magazines. There's a quite substantial biological and genetic component in terms of the risk of developing an eating disorder. And actually, some somewhat recent research has found that we may even be undercounting the extent to which genetic predisposition is a risk factor for anorexia. Genetic research using twin studies, though, has found that there is quite a strong genetic component or risk factor for the development of eating disorders, including anorexia. Additionally, you do see some differences in neurotransmitters might play a role in terms of a biological predisposition to eating. For example, individuals with anorexia have a very, very different brain response to the experience of food and eating. People who have a healthy relationship with food often see food and eating as a pleasant experience, and your brain will definitely read that. Your pleasure centers of the brain will go crazy when you eat something delicious. Individuals with eating disorder don't show this normal response to food. It might instead be an object of fear and anxiety. So, definitely, there's a large biological component in terms of risk of developing an eating disorder. Additionally, you see differences in the self control and reward centers of the brain. Like I mentioned, individuals with eating disorder likely will not get the same rewarding experience from eating. And additionally, you see self control is a major feature in terms of having an eating disorder. So, individuals with anorexia, for example, exert extreme self control versus individuals with bulimia or binge eating have difficulty employing self control. And again, brain areas that are associated with the ability to control yourself definitely do appear to be differentially or look a little bit different in individuals with eating disorders. So that's going to finally do it for all of these topics on psychological disorders. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's a lot in the DSM. There's a lot of disorders that I didn't cover. I encourage you to take a look at the DSM because there's lots of really, really interesting diagnoses that exist out there and really well thought out diagnostic criteria for them. So I'll leave it there for today. I hope you're having an excellent day and not getting the coronavirus. Bye.